optimism. Member states implement the new legislation diligently and take the necessary operational steps to apply it in practice. In the first scenario, asylum systems are upgrading across the Union, thus overcoming entrenched deficits. Belgium, for instance, offers adequate reception conditions for everyone. Note that the optimist first scenario is not about open borders. The pact aims at better migration management in terms of preventing secondary movements and delivering returns. However, the optimist first scenario assumes that bona fide implementation will achieve better management in full compliance with human rights. If that happened, if the first scenario came true, member states would regain confidence in their ability to control migration and uphold the right to asylum at the same time. The solidarity mechanism would be effective, even pushbacks allegations might disappear. It is the institutional responsibility of the Commission to subscribe to the first scenario. Nevertheless, an alternative outcome is equally possible. I've called it pessimism. Under the second scenario, infringement proceedings and penalty payments do not succeed in forcing rebels such as Hungary into line. Open resistance continues and other countries might follow. However, the pessimist second scenario is not confined to open rebels. Flagrant implementation deficits exist elsewhere as well. Think of substandard reception conditions, pushback allegations, secondary movements, the return rate, and lengthy asylum procedures. These existing deficits might be complemented by new ones, for instance, with regard to the fiction of non-entry or the crisis regulations, themes which we will discuss today and tomorrow. Under the second scenario, member states lack the political will and or the administrative capacities to apply the new legislation better than the current one. I leave it up to you to decide which scenario you deem more likely. Mixed results are, of course, equally possible. There are indicators supporting both outcomes. On the one hand, the agreement on the pact seems to have rebuilt trust between the member states. The Commission is determined to use the annual governance cycle described by Philippe to promote capacity planning and forward-looking planning, thus giving credibility to the optimist outlook. On the other hand, some deficits may be so entrenched that political will may not suffice to overcome them. I will use Germany as an example later on to discuss the potential of disruptive political events which might increase the appetite for alternative solutions inside and outside the EU framework. It would be negligent for experts to bust their head in the sand and to pretend that optimism will inevitably prevail. Next, innovative solutions. Anyone reading the mission letter for Commissioner designate Markus Brunner or the draft conclusions for today's European Council will come across the promise of innovative or new solutions. Innovation is a positive term which is increasingly being used as a code word for controversial projects. On the right side, you may find an excerpt from this year's EPP election manifesto, that is the party of Ursula von der Leyen and Magnus Brunner. It describes the idea behind safe third countries, which most of you will know anyway. Anyone applying for asylum should be transferred to a third state where he undergoes the asylum process under the authority of this state. In case of a positive outcome, the third state will grant protection, not an EU member state. The underlying rationale is apparent. Implementation is supposed to lead to a substantial decrease in the number of arrivals once potential applicants realize that their dream of living in the EU will come to nothing. Safe third country concepts are notoriously difficult to implement. There are diplomatic, practical, legal, and procedural hurdles. It is not enough to convince third states to cooperate and to guarantee reliable asylum systems in these countries. In addition, stumbling blocks exist within the EU. In the negotiations on the new pact, Germany insisted on the so-called connection criterion. It effectively prohibits the transfer of asylum applicants to third states where they had not previously lived for a longer period, such as Rwanda. The connection criterion was one major reason why the Commission has been tasked, in accordance with the quote on the top right, to report as early as next summer about whether targeted amendments to the new legislation are warranted. The assessment is an integral part of the new pact, and it seems that the Commission will take it seriously. Even if the connection criterion was abolished, procedural hurdles within the EU would remain. In accordance with the Asylum Procedures Regulation, any transfer to a third state presupposes an admissibility check on European soil. Such procedures take time, thus undermining the deterrent effect. Anyone interested in these questions is invited to consult an expert's opinion, which I've written and which you may find via the. It's more than 60 pages, respond to a request by the German Christian Democrats, who very much promote the idea at the European level as well. It is impossible to prove any causalities, but I realized that German politicians started mentioning the idea less prominently after they had read the executive summary of my expert opinion. Growing awareness of the various hurdles may be one reason why two other innovative solutions are increasingly being emphasized. Our commentator, Georg Luke, will mention return hubs later on. That's why I limit myself to a brief assessment how they relate to our initial inquiry about optimism and pessimism. It seems to me that from a purely political perspective, so from the perspective of the pact itself, they could be neutral. If, of course, we accept that return decisions should be enforced in full compliance with the prohibition of refoulement. They could even be a border building block, rendering the return component of the border procedure effective. That could be part of an optimist outlook if, as stated earlier, member states do establish border procedures which are swift and fair and full compliance with human rights at the same time. I will come back to the impact of the Safe Third Country schemes on our initial inquiry at the end. Next, Germany. Over the past years, consecutive German governments have, as you know, defended a balanced approach in line with the optimist first outlook. That may have changed for good this summer for two interrelated reasons. First, municipalities complain ever louder about strained resources for the reason indicated on the left side of the slide. According to UNHCR, 7.4 million refugees were living in the EU at the end of last year, including Ukrainians. 2.6 million, or 35%, were residing in Germany. That is in absolute numbers and per capita much more than in Greece, Italy, and many other member states. Second, there was a terrorist attack which put the Dublin system in the spotlight, as the authorities had tried unsuccessfully to return the Islamist perpetrator to Bulgaria. Over several weeks, the media discussed the statistics on the front page. In relations with countries of first arrival in particular, Dublin is totally dysfunctional. Italy refuses to cooperate. There were only 11 voluntary returns, while the success rate for Bulgaria stands at 5% and for Croatia at 2%. It is this reality of secondary movements which explains the graph on the left side. Many refugees end up in Northern Europe sooner or later. I know that in academic circles, the focus is usually in Italy and Greece being overburdened, but don't estimate the political effects of these graphs on the left side. The public visibility of these figures had an impact. The opposition leader, Friedrich Merz, officially declared that Germany should follow its neighbors and stop respecting Dublin. In practical terms, this would mean that Germany rejects or refuses entry to asylum applicants at its border. That is a move which has been discussed quite vividly within Germany over the past 8-9 years already. To justify that outcome, the opposition leader invoked a provision many have not heard of, Article 72 TFEU on the top left, according to which EU asylum legislation shall not affect the exercise of national responsibility with regard to law and order and internal security. Several judgments of the court have aligned this provision to the well-known public policy caveats in the single market, such as Article 36 on goods for the experts. The citation on the bottom left summarizes the core idea behind almost a dozen judgments in which member states had invoked the provision already, but failed to convince the court. It says that Article 72 does not confer the power to depart from EU legislation without any oversight by the court. To put it differently, yes, it is possible to invoke Article 72 to justify non-compliance. So it's a legally sound argument to start with, but judges in Luxembourg hold the ultimate authority to decide whether the invocation is justified or not. Considerations of time prevent me from digging any deeper. For our debate, for our purposes, the German debate remains theoretical for the moment. Friedrich Merz is the opposition leader, but this may change soon. Opinion polls leave little doubt that he will become chancellor by next autumn at the latest. Expect its government to finally abandon the conciliatory approach under recourse to Article 72 or by other means. As mentioned earlier, I use Germany as an example of potential disruptive political effects in the next 5 years, pushing asylum policy towards the pessimist scenario. Read the signs on the wall. The German opposition leader is not alone. The Dutch have applied for an opt-out. The French National Assembly started an action of annulment against the AMMR. Poland plans to suspend the right to asylum. Finland has adopted legislation sanctioning pushbacks. As legal academics or legal experts, as most of us are, we can easily brush aside these initiatives as being legally hopeless and bound to fail, which they are in most cases at least. Such legal considerations do not, however, undo the political dynamics these examples epitomize. And let's take the example of Greece or Poland or Lithuania. There are many member states which have been violating EU law for years, and even judgments from Luxembourg or Strasbourg were not successful in changing practices on the ground. I'm running short of time, so I will be very brief on my last theme, the external dimension. Anyone rereading the Commission's 2020 communication on the new pact will realize that the internal legislation was not the full picture. Half of the pages dealt with other elements, return, but also international cooperation, the external dimension. The external dimension has, in other words, always been the proverbial other side of the coin, as reaffirmed by Article 5 AMMR. It is widely known that it has flourished over the past years, and it will also take center stage a few meters away in the European Council today. For our purposes, we may distinguish two alternative outcomes or impact of the external dimension. The first, and optimistic outlook, focuses on what UNHCR calls the roots-based approach. International cooperation is pursued in a bona fide manner to increase protection capacities and legal pathways along the main migratory routes. A good example is the basic idea behind, not necessarily the reality of the EU-Turkey statement: improve living conditions in Turkey, create legal pathways for onward movement, and return those entering the EU irregularly. There is room for replicating this model along other migratory routes, with each route and partner country requiring a different mix of instruments. That is my personal optimistic outlook, which would complement the EU legislation with an external component. There is, however, a pessimist scenario as well, which revolves around what academics call externalization. International cooperation effectively serves as a means to reduce the number of arrivals. In contrast to the roots-based approach, such initiatives pay lip service to human rights and legal pathways. Many would claim that certain elements of the ongoing cooperation with Tunisia and Libya fall into this category. By way of conclusion, How do safe third countries fit into this overall picture? My answer is it depends. If they are primarily a means to reduce the number of arrivals at all cost, they would sustain the pessimist scenario. By contrast, they may arguably sustain the positive optimist outlook if they are integrated into a regional approach in accordance with the roots-based approach. 15 minutes is short. My time is up. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Daniel, for this very impressive presentation, which raised a lot of questions. But again, let's keep them for